What's going on, everybody?
You can do other things and you can explore different aspects of yourself and you can become a different person.
You can't use your voice, lift someone else's voice up.
Understand that you are a global citizen and you do have a responsibility.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Life Outside the Box podcast. It's been a while since we chatted, but we have a very special conversation coming up and with very, very special people. But as always, I'm Abby, and I'm joined by my wonderful co-host who I absolutely could not do this about, Asante. Thank you for being here. Before we get into this conversation, I just wanted to give a little PSA. What we're about to talk about this episode is very heavy. It's very sensitive. And if this is not the right time for you to be listening or thinking about suicide, complex mental health, give yourself grace. Skip this episode. Come back to it if you're feeling like it. But at the end of the day, everyone's mental health is their own priority. And if this is not the right time for you, it's not the right time. But with that said, let's get into the episode. Cal, I want you to introduce yourself first. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me on here. Actually, before I even introduce myself, I want to also share something for folks who are able to see my camera. I have this photo of little me, just in front that I'm thinking about today. For folks who are listening via audio, it's like a picture of me and my parents from when I think it was my 3rd birthday. And I'm wearing a pink princess dress. And it's, so I've been thinking about little me a lot. But with that, I will introduce myself. My name is Cal. My pronouns are they and them. Coming into the conversation today, I don't think it's very, very relevant necessarily to talk about my profession. But what I will say is that I am someone who hasn't spoken a lot about suicidality very openly before. I work with kids, and it's always one of those dances of, oh, is it appropriate for me to talk about this? And I know that there are a lot of minors who do follow me on social media. But when I think about little me and I think about the picture I just showed you, I've been experiencing a relationship with suicidality since I was quite young, maybe around 9 or so. And so I think it's really important that I kind of like set myself up there and I situate that, and I remember that there are kids who might be holding some really heavy stuff, maybe don't know how to even talk about it. It's hard to introduce myself outside of the context of work, but that's what I'll share now, and then hopefully more unravels as we talk.
And we have another familiar face here. Mikaela, welcome back.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
For anyone that might not know, what's your relationship with the 44 North?
Well, I started with the 44 North, I think back in 2020 or 2021 as a contributing writer, and kind of just involved in the community, here and there a couple years afterwards, and am now senior editor on our staff, which I'm super grateful for. Been on the podcast a few times, and have continued to write and edit, which are probably my 2 biggest passions or what I feel I can offer the world. So very grateful.
Amazing. Thank you all for being here. And I think before we get into the, metaphorical meat and bones of why we're meeting today, setting an intention when talking about suicide and the complexity of this topic, setting an intention is very important. And I have a quote I want to share from Tumi Maloto, and just to set the vibe, set the intention for this conversation. And it's a quote: "The more that we pathologize this impulse and make ourselves or other people wrong for experiencing it, the more we miss the wisdom of what is being communicated to us. It is not surprising that in a hyper-individualist world and culture, we think that we need to have an individual solution, unaliving to a collective problem, the capitalist, colonialist hellscape." And I'm laughing because sometimes when talking about uncomfortable and vulnerable topics, laughter is not only I don't know if it's the best medicine, but it can be a coping strategy. And I think that's definitely how I tend to cope with things that maybe not everyone is completely comfortable talking about, which, doubling down, I think, is why this conversation today is very, very important. So without further ado, Asante, I'll stop talking.
No, you're as usual saying very, very wise things. And I'm glad that you spoke about, what the laugh means. Because I think sometimes we can be a little discompassionate in how we assess the way people talk about, show up for difficult subjects and difficult topics. And sometimes, a laugh, whether it's out of discomfort or whether it's to try to, manage what's happening in the moment, can be perfectly valid. And I think we should make space for different sorts of reactions to difficult situations. So thank you, Abby, as always.
Yeah.
Appreciate you.
Yeah, I mean, again, couldn't do this without you. And I'm so glad that, on this podcast today, we have such an amazing group of people behind this conversation. And with that said, Cal, how are you? How are you doing?
Gosh, that is such a big question. That's a huge question. I'm feeling like when I check into my body, there's a mix of anxious energy. There's also excitement and hope that exists. I was actually talking to my therapist about this, and he didn't say anything like directly about it, but his body language seemed very like, he was like, his body language told me that this is probably a good pathway. So I'm feeling really, really grateful. I've been feeling nervous about this coming up this week, but actually thinking about being on this podcast with Mikaela has given me a lot of courage. So I've been really, 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 really grateful. So thank you for having me on here. And Abby, Asante, thank you both for holding this space with us today.
Thanks for joining us. I think talking about, checking in and how are you feeling, I just want to point out that a giant rainbow has appeared outside my house. And there's a metaphor in there somewhere, but I'll stop dancing around it. Yeah, Mikaela, how are you doing?
I would say feeling similarly maybe to Cal. I think every time I know that I've got to, or maybe not got to, but am leaning into talking about suicide and my experience and relationship with it, I feel a sense of fear and maybe picking of those scabs a little bit. But I also feel a tremendous amount of hope and gratitude in where I am in my life, that I have the ability to talk about it and put words to something that has been punctuation really for my life for a long time. So all of that kind of together maybe is gratitude, appreciation, mixed of course with, a little bit of a high heart rate maybe. In a good way.
I hear that.
There's so much complexity in this topic, and not just in the topic itself, but everything around it. When we consider that, there's life around this topic, and for those of us who've experienced suicidality, it could feel all encompassing when you're deeply in it. But then when you're not in it, you can remember that there are other parts, So I think in what, you both shared around, anxiety, fear, nervousness, but also hope and gratitude, it would be, I think, wonderful if maybe you both could try to unpack that a little bit.
I can get started on that. I think, so as I said it in my introduction, and maybe this will help give more context. In my introduction, I said I don't know if it is relevant, I guess, in this context to talk about my profession, but I will share it. I'm a media producer and a public speaker. I think the more relevant right now part of it, public speaking, a big part of that has been talking about my identity, being a transgender, queer, non-binary person, and then most of my lived experience is also being a cisgender lesbian woman in a very like religious context. And so the reason why I bring that up is because that is a story that I've told for most of my life. I started sharing that story when I was around 15 years old, so over a decade. And I think sometimes people, they look at me as this person who is like, oh, you've overcome this thing and now you don't struggle, and you get to be paid to tell this story of this big struggle that happened to you when you were a kid. But I think there's a lot of, I don't want to say the word lying, but I think there is a lot of the story that's missing when I'm not able to talk about where I am currently, or how that impacts me, or how the systems that we're in continue to impact me. And so I think the anxiety comes from not looking like a perfect person, or not looking like maybe the idea that other people might think that I am, or people thinking that I'm trying to get attention by being honest. And then when I think about all that, I'm like, wait, this is the reason why it's important to talk about it, because I'm sure I'm not the only person who feels these feelings. And the more that it's normalized to not talk about it, I think that's actually incredibly harmful, because then people aren't reaching out for help. So the anxiety is coming from a lot of different places, but I think a lot of it is judgment, and just the ways in which the systems talk about this, and how much stigma and shame that there still is. I think it's been great that there's been so much more conversation around mental health, but yeah, that's where my head is at. That's a really great question. Thank you, Asante.
Thank you. Looking at you, Mikaela.
Yeah, I would agree in that I feel often there's this like assumption that, when you like, I guess backtrack a little bit for context, am quite, or have been quite open and public about some of what I've experienced related to suicide. And I think an assumption that comes with that is that I've, kind of similar to what Cal said, I've crossed a bridge, and I'm now, able to talk about it in a, more profound, or like well packaged maybe way. And I think that's of course not true. And I mean, just to give an example, I've attempted suicide the first time in 2017. And between 2017 and 2022, I did a lot of advocacy work, worked for a lot of organizations, research, organizations published research related to mental health and suicide. And I attempted suicide again in 2022. And I think that in between time is not negated or like untrue by any standard because of what happened years later. And I think that coexistence of feelings and emotions is really, really important. And I try to sit with the fact that they can be all there at the same time. All the memories, all of what my body feels like, because our bodies remember trauma. And then also knowing that I have skills as a writer, as an editor, as a speaker, putting things into words, and that I can bring that as well. And all of that can be in the same space. And so every time I do these kinds of things, I kind of like all of that surfaces at the same time. And it is sometimes overwhelming, sometimes difficult to navigate physiologically. Definitely sweating a little bit right now, but that's okay. And that's just a part of this, and part of like being in relationship with something and with other people when we talk about it.
You have a really good point, Mikaela. I want to explore a little bit about the word you said, in between. In leading up to this podcast, I've done a lot of research, I've read stories, but I think overall I've talked to my partner whose career is in mental health. He's worked, one-on-one with mental health as a counselor, and worked at mental health facilities. And in talking about suicide with him from, I guess, a quote unquote professional standpoint, even though is anyone really a professional? It's just human stories at the end of the day. Humans being humans, I guess, relating to each other. But one thing he brought up that I thought was important to explore here was the concept of, after. In talking with his clients, one thing that he always found struggle with was the aftermath of, and I guess, I don't know if unsuccessful is the right term. I don't really have the right term at the tip of my fingers, but, a suicide attempt that didn't work and the aftermath of that and sort of living in between. And if you're comfortable, exploring what really does that mean as someone who's, quote unquote, crossed the bridge, as you've said.
It's such a good question, and one that I don't know. I don't know how well I'm going to be able to respond to on the spot, but
yeah, is there an answer really?
I mean, that's also part of the question. Is there an answer? Do we ever have an answer? Or is it more of a response? I think maybe more of a response in this case. Like, I think, I personally don't feel like time is a linear thing. I think it's much more cyclical. And so the after is very much connected to, where, for me at least, where I first started noticing, like having those thoughts and feelings in the first place, what was initiating those, or what in my life was connected to those, and seeing where that's changed. And in both cases, for me, somebody else intervened. And so it wasn't my choice necessarily to not act. I was in the process both times. And so I think there's an interesting relationship there of like, what it means to be in community with people who know what's going on and know what could potentially happen. And being honest and open about that, especially if it's something that's recurring. And so I don't know if there's an after. I think, if we like the bridge metaphor, I think we go back and forth across the bridge many times in our lives. And I think we hang out in the middle a lot, and throw stones and things in the water and see which direction they go. And I don't think that's a bad thing or a shameful thing.
Can I hop in on that topic?
Yes,
Yeah.
I was just gonna say.
Yeah,
please.
I'm also someone who just loves imagery stuff, so I appreciate, Mikaela, what you said about walking back and forth and throwing things in the water and stuff. For my own experience, I have not attempted, but I guess when I think about crossing the bridge, at least for me, what kind of comes up is this idea of, oh, this is something that I used to struggle with and now I don't. And for context, most of my childhood, I navigated experiencing suicidal ideation, and there weren't concrete plans, but there were lots of moments where I thought something was going to happen. Like I felt like I was just there, and it's interesting because as an adult, I think for me, there's a lot of shame with feeling suicidal ideation, because part of me tells myself I should be stronger now. That was something that a past version of me dealt with, so why are you experiencing it now? And then there's also the layer too that I kind of navigate of I'm an incredibly privileged individual when you think about the context of the world. I feel fulfilled in my work. I feel like I have a great support system. I do a lot of hobbies. I think there's a lot of things where it stops me from thinking, am I allowed to feel this feeling? Which adds, I guess, a layer of confusion. So I think this idea of going back and forth on the bridge, I think, is actually really nice to hear and think about, because I think there's a validation in saying, okay, this is something that was a part of me, but I still think it's a part of me. I think I still carry little me and all this stuff that I'm going to refer to past me using she, her pronouns, because I'm assigned female at birth. But what she was experiencing, I think that still exists somewhere and it floats around, and maybe it's different now. But yeah, that's kind of what came up for me, thinking about crossing the bridge. Yeah.
I have so many thoughts. Thank you. This is amazing conversation already. I think Cal, you talk about shame, and Mikaela, I don't think you used that word, but you talked about being public. And I think as you talk about being public about something, I think that inherent in that statement is maybe we shouldn't be public. And then, we think about like what we need to do to normalize. And, I think all of us like in this space are sort of the kind of people who seek to be anti-stigma advocates and normalize. But here we are having the conversation, still feeling this sort of like trepidation or maybe shame about having suicidal feelings or, that sort of thing. Where does that come from and manifest within us, but also in how we connect to society's ideals?
For me, I think about capitalism. I think about this idea that if I can't be a like stereotypically quote unquote like functioning member of society because of my mental health, then I'm a failure because I can't work. I can't make money. I can't pay the bills. I can't do this. I can't do that. Which is really unfortunate because I like to think that it would be so much better if we were able to ask the question, okay, I'm struggling. How do I support myself instead of how do I push through in order to survive? I think like that's like the first place that I go to. And then I also think about cultural pieces as well. I grew up in a very Filipino immigrant household. Mental health just wasn't talked about. I know that's a kind of a common thing when we're thinking about, I don't know, I feel like I've heard that commonly, but I think also the cultural pieces of my parents being born and raised in the Philippines and what access is there to talk about mental health. And then too, the religious shame around it as well. So there's culturally within Filipino culture, it's pretty connected to being Catholic because of the Philippines being colonized by the Spanish. And so there's also levels there where in Catholicism it's a sin to take your own life too. And this idea that you're going to go to hell if you take your own life. So there's a lot of layers and shame around, okay, I shouldn't, quote unquote, I shouldn't feel this feeling because I'm going to go to hell, because I won't be able to make money, because, this, that, the other thing. On top of already, I think to be seen struggling is a vulnerable and scary thing. Yeah. I think I'll leave that there because I feel like I could talk about a lot of things. I could expand on that later, but yeah, Mikaela, I want you to have space to talk about this too.
Yeah, I resonate with what you said, and it's bringing to mind that quote. Krishnamurti, I believe, said it, of it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society, which I think just, we're all feeling that right now in one way or another, and very much connected to the idea of sin. And even right when we say, most common phrasing is committed suicide, as if you committed a crime, as if you were a criminal, and whether or not you take it as, like literally criminal crime, or like what other sorts of things do we attribute to being a crime in our lives? A crime for who? For the people who are impacted. And I think I personally come back to a lot the idea of like what our reasons to live are, and I think I struggle with that sometimes in this conversation. And to your question, Asante, like it comes from this feeling of like a responsibility, a sense of being needed, being of value in other people's lives. But I think that can also be absorbed in a very complicated way, and that there's a sense of guilt of like, if I were to end my life, how would that impact somebody else? And carrying that framework only oriented towards other people versus yourself is a really tricky thing. And I think we hold that in our bodies very much, especially when we're in close relationships with other people who, of course, we know would be deeply impacted and hurt, if when we're struggling or if we were to end our lives. And so I think about that a lot, and that's constantly in my mind. And I think the other thing too is, and Cal, I know you and I have talked about this a little bit, like the idea of bleeding from a wound versus a scar. And it was something that somebody I worked with a long time ago originally told me, that he originally phrased it as it's better to present your experiences publicly from a scar instead of a wound. And that, presenting from a wound is maybe more reserved for your journal or people who are very close to you. And I've thought about that phrasing a lot because I think there is some truth to it, but I don't think it's a it can be applied at face value, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I think sometimes bleeding from a wound, to stick with the metaphor, is what's needed. I think to be seen raw, to be seen really struggling, to be honest and open about that, even in public settings, in a podcast, in conversations, in writing, whatever it is. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, or that we should carry shame if we can't perfectly articulate or capture what it is that we're feeling. Because something like suicide, I don't think always has words, a word-based equivalent, or even a photographic equivalent or artistic equivalent or anything. So yeah, that's a bit of a mishmash of things that I've been thinking about related to that, but good question.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Mikaela. Actually, I just wanted to add one thing, if that's okay. Yeah. What you're saying there about the quote of bleeding from a wound versus a scar, like a healed scar. I've been thinking about that a lot too, and it's interesting. I think at least my thought. I mean, there's lots of layers and lots of complex thoughts around this, but when I'm thinking about telling a story, like for example, like the story that I tell when I run things, and I share my story of my growing up experience, it is, I think, easier for the audience also to digest what I'm saying when I'm saying, oh, that was in the past. You don't actively need to hold this right now. But if I'm saying currently I am experiencing suicidal ideation, for example, I think there's a lot more discomfort around how does one hold this active thing happening. But I think there's, at least for me, I think that there's benefit in being honest with that. So I'll share my own experience here recently. So just last month I turned 28, and my 27th year was really, really difficult. I think for most of the year I did want to take my life, and I want to also say beside that, like, I have a very good relationship with my therapist. I have a great chosen family. I have mentors. I have a lot of support. So I want to say I'm saying this from a really privileged place. But yeah, I think it took me a long time to tell my chosen family and to even tell a therapist that, hey, this is what I'm experiencing right now, that I'm scared that I'm not going to make it to 28. Because I didn't want people to have to hold that. I think for such a long time, I've been the person who is holding things for others, / I don't know, viewed as a very, very enthusiastic person. And I am that person, and like both exist. And so it was really hard for me to start telling my chosen family and just people around me of like, hey, this is where I'm at. And I want to say this out of advocating for my own mental health. But also, like, maybe it's actually really important that I talk about it, because maybe other people would want to be like, oh, I also feel that way. And it's a little less scary when there's someone else who is also actively feeling that. of course, there's like nuances. Like I never want to trauma dump on people or anything of that sort. So asking for consent and everything. But yeah, lately I've been thinking a lot about how can I be more honest with the people around me, because maybe someone else is also feeling like they're bleeding, but they don't know how to say that they're actively bleeding. So yeah, what you said there, Mikaela, reminded me of that. So thanks for giving me the space to share that.
Kayla, I can't stop thinking about the bleeding from a wound and bleeding from a scar metaphor. And you always come in with the best, as a writer and a creative brain myself. Sometimes like imagery and metaphors or, picture says 1,000 words, metaphor says, far more than the few words. And I've been taking notes this, the past half an hour that we've been together, and highlighted, I have shame, grief, and language. And what you both were saying about the, religious aspect of how we talk about suicide and suicide being sin, and, the modern language of suicide being committed suicide. And, even, on either side of, to use the bridge metaphor, it's the shame is still there in talking about people who have died by suicide. And again, I don't know if there's answers when talking about suicide, but like you said, Mikaela, there's most certainly responses. And I wanted to get both of your opinions on the language around suicide, and not only why it's so important to obviously talk about suicide, but talk about suicide in the way that removes the shame. And I don't know if normalize is the right word, but, I'm asking, in your opinion, what is the right words? What should you say in these conversations to take away the shame? Because, I don't think shame gets us anywhere. So, Cal, I'll jump back to you.
I love that. That's a really, really great question. Thank you, Abby. Yeah. So actually, I want to share a story. Someone close to me within my family of origin attempted when I was like maybe in my late teens or early 20s, and the information got back to me. And I was having a conversation with my grandmother, my Lola, and she was essentially telling me like, "Oh, did you hear so and so tried to commit suicide, quote unquote." And we were talking about it, and I told her, I'm like, well, I've also experienced a lot of suicidal ideation, and throughout my childhood, I could have also easily attempted. And she said, "Yeah, but you're strong enough, and that's why you didn't." And I immediately got angry and defended the person who had attempted. And that's, I think, the first time I've ever really gotten angry at my Lola. Like that's and like really, been activated in front of her in that way. But I thought it was interesting the ways that she thought about this idea of it's related to strength, that you're not strong enough. And I had to really like sit and explain to her, and like I understand she didn't have the access to information to like understand everything in like a more, I guess, mindful way. But I explained to her it's around being sick. It's around a lot of different things. In this certain case, it was around like sickness. But yeah, I think at least for me, I've had lots of conversations with my family of origin around mental health. I have several folks within my family of origin who are struggling with their own mental health, and like they don't even know how to begin talking about it, because they have this idea that it means that you are weak if you are struggling with that, or if you're thinking about like that they don't want to be alive. And I think the first thing that I've really brought up was that it is okay, like you are not in trouble if you say that. And I think that's like the first thing that I've spoken to people about this. And then I think also too, just not having a reaction that will scare them from talking about it more. So how can I how can I support is usually a question I'll ask at the kind of at the end, or just sitting and listening. I think just being there has been really, really helpful for some of the folks, specifically in my family of origin, who have talked about this. And it's like their first times as like adults speaking of this, especially in like a culture that really, really didn't talk about it. And allowing that those feelings that might feel, I guess, yucky for them to talk about or to say it out loud. Celebrating that they were able to tell me. I think there's a lot of gratitude that I share. I say thank you so much for telling me that. I'm really glad you told me that. If it's relevant, like I'll share my own experience around it. But in that conversation that we're having, just normalizing that it's okay to not have these happy feelings all the time. It doesn't mean that you're weak. Yeah, those are thoughts that come to mind. I think I may have run in a few circles there, but yeah, that's my answer to that question. Great question.
Yeah. I honestly am coming back to Tumi's words, which we started with, and like finding language. And I don't know if there's specific words that we can use to like define what we mean by suicide or what we mean by death associated with it or loss. But I think validating the impulse that was in that quote that Tumi was talking about, validating where the impulse comes from. I mean, truthfully, living in a capitalist colonial world, I don't find it surprising that suicide rates are climbing. And that's a very sad prospect maybe to think about. But I think it's important to recognize and to say and to validate when you're talking to somebody who's struggling with it because they maybe don't know or aren't connecting with the world in that way or making those associations that when you have suicidal ideation or an impulse, it's telling you something's wrong. It's actually the correct response. It's actually the right response to feel like something is wrong and therefore I've got to do something about it. And I think we can validate that, of course, without encouraging, like, I think the action and behavior, then that's where you step in as somebody who's supporting to connect them to resources or to be part of their support network. So I think that's really important. I would also say, I think we tend to offer what we think is a comforting and very well used phrase of like, the world is a better place with you in it, or you are needed. And they seem very harmless and very gentle. But I think underneath that, the subtext of that is, you know, your needed centers not the person struggling. It centers everybody else. It's saying you're needed by someone else. And then the world is a better place with you in it is not saying anything about the world in which they're inhabiting. The world has to be a better place for them as well. And so I think unpacking, like really, you know, what it is that we're saying and saying what we mean is really important. And the last thing I'll say is like, from the research that I know of, oftentimes when somebody is sharing about experiences of suicidal ideation or an attempt or loss, the tendency is to confide in one person who they really, really trust, which of course makes sense. There's going to be somebody who you feel most safe, most comfortable speaking to, and that's not a bad thing. But it has to be, like, if you're in a supportive role, I think it has to be a gateway. And my somebody I worked with a long time ago taught me that your support network kind of has to be a wheel, and that if you're supporting somebody else, you can only be one spoke on the wheel. The wheel can't turn on its own with only one spoke. And so you can be the person, like if you're the first spoke and they come to you first, that's wonderful. And then you can help them build the other spokes so that the wheel can turn. and that's not necessarily as connected to language per se, but in those kinds of spaces when you're talking to people who are confiding in you, or when you're confiding in somebody else, being thoughtful about that, that we don't, we're not either asking, too much, asking one person to carry our need for support, or when we are that person carrying somebody else's struggles on our own, that we're able to help fan that out a little bit, in a safe way, as safe a way as is possible.
Wow. Deep stuff. I want to ask a sensitive question. Reasons for death and reasons for life. What comes up for you?
I can hop in on this because that's been something I've been exploring as I gave the context of the last year of me being alive. Reasons for life. I've been talking to a lot of my trusted folks, and my as Mikaela described, my wheel spokes, I guess. I've been speaking to a lot of really, really wonderful, supportive people in my life, including my therapist. And I have this one mentor who simplified it for me. I was like, oh, like, I was talking about things in very abstract ways, like, because it was like, well, stars, I do love stars in general, but they said you can simplify what makes you feel excited about being alive. Like, the list that I came up with is karaoke, ice cream, board games. That's my main three, and then I'm sure there's many reasons why I feel excited and enthusiastic about life. But I come back to those things where if I'm like, I'm just gonna go get ice cream and just hold on to that for today, and then what the next day comes. I think a big thing that was a big sticking point in this last year for me has been feeling stuck in the systems that we're in, of thinking, oh, like, I have to work in order to make money, and then if I don't do that, like, there's no being able to fight the entire system, and feeling really, really hopeless. I often think about my own privilege, and then I think about the people who don't have the same privileges as me, and I get really, really angry about it. And then it just feels like, what can I do? There's nothing I can do, and then I shouldn't be alive, because what's the point? That has been probably the most common thread that has shown up for me this last year. I think a lot of it is unfortunately like rooted in things that maybe are bigger than me, things that I can't control at this very moment. So rumination has been a big part of what I've been working on. But yeah, that's actually a very relevant thing that I've been thinking about. And how do I fight for a life that I feel excited to live has been also a big thing I've been thinking about. Yeah, that's the end of my thought.
For me, I think on the death side of things, what's been very present is like this awareness that the systems that we have been taught to contribute to be a part of in a very particular way are unraveling for a lot of good reasons, and not. I think all that coexists, but I think having not necessarily your worldview, but a somewhat of a clear, this is the set of steps you go through for your life, having that really being questioned and kind of falling apart, again, for a lot of very good reasons, can be terrifying and can feel like, okay, so why am I sitting at my desk responding to emails? What am I doing? Especially when you're aware of, like Cal said, how many people don't have the same privileges as you do, who can't as easily access things that make them happy or feel joy or a sense of rest, who physiologically can't connect with what rest actually should be in your body, because they are experiencing ongoing trauma. It's not post-traumatic, it's ongoing. And all of that kind of together very much can make you feel hopeless, and has definitely made me feel hopeless at many times. But I do think action, in whatever way you're able to offer it, whatever way I've been able to offer it, has felt like a little bit of maybe a temporary antidote of like, where do I have the ability to make changes? And oftentimes that's in small community, and it's not a big, massive, broad thing. You're not going to single-handedly topple a government, but you can act in smaller capacities. And I think that is a reason to, or like gets me connected back to feeling alive. And I think aside from like very specific things that make me happy, like How to Train Your Dragon and coffee and books, I've been really connecting with what grief feels like, because I think grief in a very interesting way is connected to sadness, love, and rage all at the same time, like smushed together. And I think that's part of why when we are grieving, when we actively feel grief, we feel very alive, which is a very strange thing, because you'd think, oh, you turn inwards and you feel sadness. And I think sadness is a different thing than grief. So I've been trying to connect with like, what is the love side of grief? What is the rage as action side of grief when I'm carrying that and I feel that in my body? And I think that also makes me feel that sense of like energetically being alive, being a human, and wanting to continue that. Yeah, that's what's coming to mind for me.
You said the key word, Mikaela, which, as we're approaching end of the hour, something that I wanted to talk about was privilege around mental health. And I know we hear in almost, or I would say every single mental health space, it's so important to talk about mental health. Yes, but why? And that's something I want to explore here is, why is it important to talk about mental health? And for me, it's using the privilege that I have to talk about mental health, to, have time to talk about mental health, to have the resources to talk about mental health, the words, putting words into these feelings. And, for an example, I think of single parents working 3 jobs who quite literally can't afford time or, for financial reasons to address their mental health. And I think of, young kids going into college maybe for the first time and not even knowing where to turn, not having these paths they can follow, and here's how to get help and here's the steps. And I think talking about mental health also talks about, the privilege to have resources at your disposal. I think words and time, maybe for me, being top of my list of privileges that I have, that I'm able to use and address my mental health. So, Cal, I wanted to throw it to you first. Privilege and mental health. What's coming to mind for you there?
Yeah, and thank you so much for listing out those, Abby. Appreciate it. For me, financial stability is a big one. Being able to pay for therapy. I think also social circles. I have the privilege of being able to go out and meet people and build really, really meaningful, strong friendships who are able to meet me with grace and compassion and understanding, because they've been on their own journey when it comes to mental health and educating themselves on how to support someone. I'm also self-employed, and so Addie, what you said there of like a single parent or even someone who just immigrated to a new country and they have to figure out their life, or they have so many responsibilities that they have to think about first. I think about that actually a lot with my own parents, being immigrants. I'm second generation Canadian, and I feel like I've been able to do so many things with my life. And I feel awful and also grateful at the same time. But being someone who's self-employed and I run my own business, I'm able to step away and be like, I am burnt out. I can walk away from this and go take care of myself. I can put more time into eating more ice cream and having bubble tea and playing board games because that's what I know that I need for my own mental health. Like, there's absolutely privilege in being able to do those things. And yeah, Abby, as you said, the rest part, to even pause and say, how does my body feel? Like, do I need to take a rest? Can I take a rest? And taking those steps. And then I guess the last thing I'll say here is being able to have this conversation with all of you. That is a big privilege. I, again, it's interesting, going back to my work and my career, I get to choose the folks that I work with, and I'm also within a lot of spaces where people are very, very supportive about me being open about my mental health and where I'm at. And maybe that's not the same for someone who, if they spoke openly about their own suicidality, there could be like shame around that, or they could maybe get in trouble because they're being associated with a certain company or something. Yeah, that's where I'll end off on that.
Yeah, thanks, Cal. I think for me, a lot of similar things. Like, I have the privilege of being able to work in a way that very much aligns with like what I feel I can best like offer the world, which is a huge privilege and something I'm incredibly grateful for. I think also just, like, yeah, like I'm trying to figure out how to word this, like being able to share my experiences in ways that are conducive like to those skill sets, I think. And that's not true of everybody. Like as a writer, as like being able to talk and being able to write about what I've experienced, whether that's with people who are close to me or in these kinds of settings or like as my job. I think that's where there's a lot of difficulty in communication and trying to have conversations in like other settings for other people who aren't aligned in those ways and can't be or are barred from it. I'm also a white cisgender woman. I think there's a lot of privilege that comes with that. And I'm in connection with the entirety of my family, my immediate family. There's 8 of us. A lot of privileges. I think I could go on. And I think also here, when we talk about privilege, we have to talk about this sort of assumption that stopping somebody from dying by suicide is the same as reducing their thoughts about it. Because I think the people who end up in hospitals on 5150 holds and who end up in the medical system, in the criminal justice system, when they're connected to suicide attempts or mental health issues kind of broadly, those tend to be like Black, non-binary individuals, trans, and it's I think we need to be aware of that and bring that into the conversation, because we're talking about like suicidal ideation and how to reduce the thoughts, and living with the thoughts is a very community oriented thing, and it has to happen in community. We can't try and put a band-aid on, just stopping the act from happening, because that doesn't actually address the issue at its root. It's like the parable, I think it's like the upstream parable or something along those lines, where it's like this villager sees people drowning in a river, and they jump in the river and try and immediately help people who are actively drowning, and other villagers come and join and try and help. And then somebody eventually says, I'm actually going to go up the stream and see why they're falling in the first place. And I think that is very much connected to privilege, and very much connected to how we address gaps in care and resources in communities outside of our own, communities broadly. And I feel like, as I've tried to reckon with where I have privileges in my life, try to think about where I fit, where do my skills, where does my knowledge or what have you fit into that conversation, and what can I do about it? Yeah, it was a bit of a roundabout way of answering the question, but
Awesome. So in this conversation, I think like those of us who are sort of entrenched in the mental health world, we kind of, there's a level of like nuance that we can approach this conversation with. But just generally speaking, what do you hope folks who may not be so attuned to this conversation can take away from it? Doesn't have to be a deep thought, we're coming up on the hour, so it could be succinct, so yeah.
I hope that someone who's listening, who isn't very attuned to this topic, just has a little bit more information. If they hear the topic of suicidality come up again, that they remember that this conversation happened. I think that the unpacking of complex ideas and thoughts and feelings, at least for me, happens over time, and years later something will click. And I hope that this is maybe a baby step or a big step or whatever step it is, to something clicking, and maybe them either feeling empowered to reach out for help for themselves, or to support someone who might need that.
yeah, I would echo that and say this episode can be a spoke on the wheel, even if that's just temporary, and if it's a catalyst to support in some way, and just even if it's just to not feel alone, and to see that all of us today, and answering, like responding, I'm gonna stick with the word responding to questions in the conversation, we didn't have perfect answers to anything, and we didn't perfectly articulate anything. Very real, very connected to our own experiences. And I think if that can be an example, if that can be a guide, a support, I hope it can be, because talking about this is not, it's never going to be perfectly put into words, and we all bring to it what we can. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you both for joining us on this conversation. I can't imagine any of this is, easy, air quotes. And yeah, I just want to thank you for joining us on this journey about talking about how to bleed from a wound. Yeah. Thank you both.